So welcome back to part two of our lecture series on Islam from 1250 to 1450. So if in our first part of our lecture we had talked about Muhammad and the rise of Islam, then we had talked about the right legato caliphs that take over after Muhammad dies, and then the Umayyad dynasty that had expanded Islam. Today we're going to talk about the Abbasid dynasty. So the Abbasid dynasty is going to last from 750 to 1258, and it is a dynasty that is more known for maintaining and flourishing than spreading Islam. So on the left-hand side, we see the Umayyad dynasty, stretching from here in Spain, all Andalus, all the way into what will be northwestern India. So it's a very large and expansive empire. It didn't last very long. It was an expanding empire. The next dynasty to take over from the Umayyad is the Abbasid. The Abbasid are not a conquering dynasty, but they will, like I said, see trade and knowledge flourish during their time. When the Umayyads took over after the Abbasid fall, they, for the most part, kept most of the Islamic world, except they do lose what is kind of Spain and North Africa. So this is known as Al-Andalus, which is going to remain in Umayyad hands. But for the most part, the Islamic world is under Abbasid control. The only battle that we're going to talk about during the Abbasid dynasty is the Battle of Talas. It takes place up here in western Central Asia, and it is between Abbasid Muslim forces and Chinese forces that have been spreading across the Silk Roads, trying to conquer more and more of Silk Road Central Asia. The Muslims win that battle, and so that part of the world will remain in Muslim hands. For the most part, though, that's it as far as battles go. So let's talk about administration of the Abbasid Empire. The Abbasid Empire is going to be divided up into provinces. It's a very large empire, and so what they're going to do is they're going to divide into provinces, like we might have Tunisia as a province, or we might have Egypt as a province, or we might have, Persia as a province within the Abbasid Empire. Now, each of these provinces is going to be headed by a governor, and that governor's job is to maintain control of that region for the Abbasid Empire. More about those in just a second. The Abbasids are going to build a brand new capital for their empire. So they're going to move their capital from where the Umayyads had their capital in Damascus to a very new city that they're going to build. It's Baghdad. Here's Baghdad. And so that's going to be a new city that the Abbasid Empire builds. They do this because Baghdad is closer to the Silk Roads, which are right here. And so if you put your capital closer to the Silk Roads, that means there's going to be more wealth generated because you can tax trade. Next, let's go back to these provinces. Each province within this large Abbasid empire is going to be run by a governor, like I said, and these governors have the title of emir. So what the Abbasids do to try to keep the local people happy that they have conquered, we have lots of different ethnic groups. We have Arabs here in the Arabian Peninsula, and we're going to have people that are Egyptians here, and people that are Tunisians, and people that are going to be Turks up here, and Persians over here. And so all of these different ethnic groups, they probably don't want somebody ruling them that's not from their ethnic group. And so the Abbasids are going to put local people in charge. So these emirs are going to be, if you're over here, Tunisian or Egyptian or Persian, and that's going to make the local population happier and less likely to rebel if they're being ruled over somebody that looks like them and talks like them. Is very comforting that they're going to be ruled over somebody that's similar to them. The only caveat is they have to be Muslim. And so anybody in a position of power in the Islamic world is going to be Muslim, but they may come from different ethnicities. And this structure of using local emirs that are from the local population to keep the people happy is going to make the Abbasid dynasty a long-lasting dynasty. Next, just like the Umayyads and the right legato caliphs before them, the Abbasids do not have to worry about running a legal system. That is not something they're going to have to pay money for, because a legal system, just like previous Islamic states, are going to be based on Sharia law. It's going to be based on laws from the Quran. So when two people have a disagreement, what they do is they go to a local religious leader who's well-versed in the Quran, or they may go to a local scholar who has studied the Quran, and they will then rule on who's in the right and who's in the wrong using the Quran Sharia law as the guide. So these Islamic scholars and Islamic religious teachers are known as ulama and qadis, and they're going to be the the people using the legal system. Next, the government is going to create kind of a large public school system under the Abbasids, and these schools are called madrasas. And the government is in their interest to open up these schools. If you remember, this whole area is going to be, for the most part, Muslim. There's some Jews and Christians too, but for the most part, they're Muslim. And it's in their interest to create a highly literate community of people, because the more your workforce is literate, the better workers they are. The more people will be able to read and know the Quran, know the law, be able to pay their taxes. And so everybody here, we want a highly literate group of people. And plus, the Islamic world promotes education because all people are supposed to be able to read the Quran in Arabic. And so the government is going to be seen by all the religious people in the community as a good government because they're promoting Islam. Next, now at the very top, of course, of this government structure of the Abbasids is the Khalif. That is something that's going to be continued from the Umayyad dynasty. So the Khalif is going to be a central, all-powerful ruler, the emperor, if you will, and he is the political ruler of the empire. And while he cannot say that God chose him to be a new prophet because Muhammad was the seal of the prophets or the last of the prophet, he also is responsible for promoting and spreading Islam. And so we have this all-powerful religious and political leader definitely all-powerful, religious leader in the sense that he's supposed to be responsible for being a caretaker of Islam and spreading it. And so we have this position of the Khalif continuing. Next, let's talk about trade. And this is really what the Abbasid Empire is known for, their ability to promote trade. Like I said, they're not a conquering empire. And so what happens is, as you can see, the Islamic Empire is this Abbasid Empire is a long east-west empire. And it's going to be lots of free trade going on. The Abbasids want to spend money on troops and police and roads and a navy to make sure that there's no robbers, there's no pirates, that everybody that's on the trade routes is going to be protected so that people feel free to trade. Now this is good for the government. If people are trading more, then the government can tax that trade wherever it stops in a port or a town, and that's going to generate wealth for the government. So the more trade there is, the more wealth there is for the government, and they last longer. So what does the government do to promote trade besides make it safe? The government is going to build these things called caravanserai. And we see a picture down below. A caravanserai is going to be in a dry, arid place, wherever there's an oasis or they're going to dig a well. It's going to be a place that merchants can stop and get their camels and horses watered. They can also get some water for themselves. The caravanserai is an enclosed, safe space that is protected around this well, and so merchants have a safe place to eat and to rest and to stop. So this is going to make it more likely that people want to trade across these big arid spaces. In addition to that, they'll be protected so nobody can rob them there, and so it makes trade go up. And again, we said that we like trade. But then these caravanserai sometimes will develop into towns themselves because we'll have this large open space and people will naturally start to trade there. And that trade will bring in customers, and more customers will bring in more merchants, and more merchants will bring in more customers and artisans. And so we see that they sometimes form the basis of towns themselves. Next, let's talk about maritime technology. And so Muslims are, yes, going to be trading back and forth over land, especially since the Silk Roads are right here, at least the western end of the Silk Roads. But we're also going to see maritime trade primarily in two places. We're going to see Indian Ocean maritime trade in the Islamic world, and we're going to see maritime trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. So these two places are going to be where Muslim sailors are going to move back and forth, moving goods back and forth. Now, sailing on the ocean is a dangerous business. Besides the storms, if you leave sight of land, you can get lost. And so from China, they're going to learn about the compass. The first compass was invented in China. You can see it right here. And so through maritime and overland trade, Muslim merchants will get in contact with Indian merchants who got in contact with Southeast Asian merchants who got in contact with Chinese merchants as we go from west to east. And people are going to be like, well, what's that? Oh, this is a compass. Well, what does it do? And they're going to start to learn about the compass and use it so they know always which way is north, south, east, and west, so they won't get lost on the ocean. Next, what we're going to see is something called the astrolabe, which is right here. Now, the astrolabe was invented by the ancient Greeks. And so Muslims are going to, as they trade with Greece, they're going to learn about this astrolabe. And you can't see it, but on the outside of the astrolabe, there are these little tick marks like a ruler. And what you do is in the daytime, you can use the position of the sun at noon, or at night you can use the position of the stars, and you can use that position to measure your latitude on the surface of the earth. And so with the compass and the astrolabe, these are navigational tools that will help Muslim merchants safely travel back and forth across their trade routes to get from the port they want to get to back home, and so they have more successful trade. Then the last piece of maritime technology that the Muslims learned about is this right here. It's called the lateen sail, or the caravel sail, but we'll just call it the lateen sail today. So the lateen sail is a triangular sail, and as you can see, it's not fixed to the mast in a permanent way. It turns. And so what this means is that you can go in any direction you want. You don't have to just go in the direction the wind blows you. So if you want to go forward, but the wind is blowing from the side, you turn your sail like you see in the picture, and they're capturing the wind, and then you use your rudder to kind of steer whatever direction you want. Once you've harnessed the power of the wind, whatever direction it's coming from, you can then use that wind by turning the sail to move the ship in any direction you want. And so now we have a much more maneuverable, safe way of traveling for Muslim merchants. Now, there's some debate about this, but the lateen sail probably came from the Indian Ocean, and that's how Muslim merchants learned about it as they trade with people from India. Next, banking. And so banking is going to be a way to pay for these expensive voyages. So you can imagine if you're trading from the coast of India through the Persian Gulf to eventually get to Baghdad, that's a long journey. And it's going to be expensive. You have to pay for the ship and the captain and the supplies and the trade goods and the crew, etc., etc. And so in order to raise money for this, we have to invent new financial systems. So the first thing we're going to talk about is banking. So what happens with a bank is, here is our guy, he's a banker, right? And here we have some rich person, right? So here they have their money, and they're afraid that their money is going to get stolen or robbed, or it may get lost, or it may get burned down if their house burns down. So what rich people do is they put their money in the banker's house, and he has a safe, right, that he guards, and he charges them money for keeping their money safe. All right, so this guy now has everybody's money, and he's charging the people who put their money there a small fee, right, to keep their money safe, and everybody's happy. This guy has his money that is safe in a safe, and this guy right here, the banker, here's the banker, right, he is making a little bit of money by keeping everybody else's money safe, and that's fine. But what does that have to do with maritime trade? So what happens is, unbeknownst to the investor, this guy right here, the depositor, what the banker does is, in secret, he loans out a portion of the depositor's money, doesn't tell him. And so this little portion of money, he says, hey, does anybody need a loan? And so our merchant over here, who's, he's got his boat and he's sailing, and he's like, yeah, I need a loan, right? I need to be able to to buy a boat and those kinds of things. And so the banker, unbeknownst to the depositor, sends out some of his money over here, and this guy uses to buy the boat and go on his trade route. Now, when the merchant comes back from his trade route, and he comes back to the banker and he's, oh, that was successful. So the banker says, great, so I need the money back. And so the merchant says, happily. And so he pays the loan back, right? But he also has to pay interest. That is a fee for using the loan. And so now the banker has the original amount that this guy put in his bank, and a little bit of extra money that he charged in interest. So the banker makes money, The merchant is able to make money because he was able to pay for his trip. And then the depositor over here also has his money safe and sound, and everybody's happy. And so banking is a new way we develop to create more money to pay for some of these journeys, right? And so that's the development of banking. Now, let's now talk about letters of credit. So a letter of credit makes traveling safer. So let's say we have some merchant who's up here in modern day Afghanistan, a Muslim merchant, and he wants to travel all the way over here to Egypt, right? Now, if he's going to do that, let's say he wants to travel to Egypt to get, I don't know, cotton or something, because the people over here need cotton. So he's going to travel all the way there. Now, when he gets there, he's going to have to pay, let's say, 100 gold pieces or 100 dinars for the cotton. Well, so he's going to have to carry those gold pieces all the way across. Of course, gold is heavy and it's bulky. And if you have all these bags of gold, somebody's going to rob you because it's obvious you have it. And so he needs a lightweight, safer way to transport his money to get to Egypt. And so what he does is he goes to a banker that's here in Afghanistan and he says, hey, can I give you 100 gold pieces? And so the banker says, sure, I'll keep it safe. And he says, but I need a way of telling this banker over here that I have 100 gold pieces. And so the banker up in Afghanistan writes a letter of credit. It's just a piece of paper that says this guy is good for it. He has 100 pieces of gold in my vault up in Afghanistan. Great. So he tucks that piece of paper in. It's very lightweight. You can hide it. Nobody knows he has it. And then when he gets over here to Egypt, he comes to another banker and he says, hey, I have this letter of credit that says I'm good for 100 gold pieces. So the banker over here says, sure, I know that guy over in Afghanistan. And so he gets a letter of credit, and in return he gives him 100 gold pieces in bags of gold. And so he can go and buy his cotton and then make his way back. And so these letters of credit are an easy way to transport wealth from one far off place to another. And so in Arabic, these letters of credit are called socks. Now, eventually Europeans are going to learn about this new invention in finance, and they're going to say, ooh, what do you call those things? And the people in the Islamic world are going to say, well, they're called socks. But the Europeans are going to mishear it, and they're going to hear the word check instead of sock. I don't know how that happens, but it does. And so today, in the English-speaking world, we know these letters of credit as checks, even though they're originally called socks. And so we see these new developments in banking and finance that helps increase trade. Next, not only are we going to have to invent new technology to help trade increase, but there's also going to be new crops that are going to travel back and forth across the Eastern Hemisphere at this time because of Muslim trade. And so let's talk about that. We'll use 3 examples. So the first example, even though it's off the map, sugarcane originally came, it was a natural growing crop in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam and Indonesia and Cambodia, those modern states today. Now, as people start to trade, people from Southeast Asia take their sugarcane to people in India, and the people in India is like, oh, I love it when we break this sugarcane down into sugar, processed sugar, it's great. We really love it. And then people in the Arab world learn about it from India. And so the sugarcane is making, the crop of sugarcane is making its way from east to west. Eventually, they start growing lots of sugarcane on large plantations here in Mesopotamia, or what is modern-day Iraq. Sugarcane is a tropical crop. It needs lots of hot weather, and it needs lots of water. Well, Iraq today is it's a desert area, so you wouldn't think sugarcane would grow, but it definitely has the heat. Well, these 2 rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, are going to provide enough water, and so sugarcane becomes a very lucrative crop here in the Islamic world. Now, the Arabs are trading with people in Europe. And the Europeans are like, ooh, what is that? And I'm like, well, it's sugar. Oh, and I really like it. And we've never had sugar before. And so the Europeans really want this luxury good known as sugar. Now, the Europeans, unfortunately, cannot grow it themselves because Europe is too far north from the equator. It's too cold, not enough hot weather, but they really want it. And so the Europeans will start trading with Muslims for sugar. Not sugar cane, but sugar. And so the Muslim world is going to get very wealthy off of this luxury trade good. The next crop that's going to make its way, we're going to see is citrus fruits. And so here's a lemon. Now, most citrus fruits come from India or Southeast Asia or East Asia. That's just where they naturally occur. And so just like sugarcane, we're going to see seeds and the fruit themselves go from east to west along the either maritime trade route in the Indian Ocean or the Silk Roads. And so people in the Arab world are going to start growing fruit that's not from there, but they're going to start growing it themselves. And that means that they're going to have a better diet. They're going to get more vitamins that they need, like vitamin C, to be able to be healthy. And so the population of the Islamic world is going to increase because they just have access to more and better food and vitamins. Now, in Europe, they're also going to get exposed to these citrus fruits, but again, the Europeans can't grow them themselves because citrus fruits are tropical and Europe is too far north, and so they're going to trade for the finished fruit themselves. They can't grow it themselves, and so once again, the Islamic world is going to get rich selling citrus fruit to the Europeans. Then the final thing we have here on this slide is cotton. Cotton is going to grow naturally in a couple of places, but for today we're going to talk about how cotton comes from India. So it's another tropical crop. And so from cotton, of course, we don't eat the cotton, but you pick it and you process it into clothing. And I'm sure you have cotton shirts at home, and cotton is lightweight and very breathable. And so if you're somebody living in the Middle East, it's very hot, you can see the appeal of having clothes made out of cotton rather than out of the fur from sheep, right, and goats, wool. And it's much more breathable than wool, and it's not as itchy and scratchy. And so we're going to see that people start to bring cotton to the Islamic world, and it'll grow there. And so they start growing their own cotton. Europeans, once again, they get introduced to this, and like, oh, we'd really love to have our clothes made from cotton rather than wool. But once again, Europe is too far north to grow cotton, and so the Islamic world is getting wealthy, giving luxury goods and sugar and cotton from their world to Europeans who have a huge demand for it and they're willing to pay top dollar. So this is a golden age in the Islamic world. They are kind of at the center of all of this trade that is going on between the rest of the world and Europe. Then the last thing we have that just popped up here is paper. So paper is something that was invented in China, and of course it's made from wood. And so before this time, whether you're in the Islamic world or whether you're in Europe, if you wanted to write something down and create a book, they were really expensive to maintain and hold knowledge, because what most things were written on at that point was parchment. Parchment is when you kill an animal and then you treat its skin, its hide, so you can write on it. And you can imagine anytime you wanted to write something down, to have to kill an animal, it's getting expensive. So the Islamic world is going to be introduced to paper from China, via India, and then trade routes. Now the Islamic world has an insatiable demand for paper, because remember, all Muslims are commanded to be able to read the Quran, and if the Quran has to be written on parchment, well, it's going to be really expensive, and not most Muslims are really going to be able to get access to it. And so for religious reasons, we see that Muslims want to have cheap, available Qurans made of paper. It's important for them religiously to be able to read and to study the Quran. Not only that, but the government can use it to keep records, keep track of trade and tax records. And so we see that paper quickly, rapidly spreads throughout the Islamic world, and eventually, like everything else, will make its way to Europe. All right, then the last thing we have on this slide is urbanization. So when you have lots of urbanization, that means you have a prosperous, healthy population. And so when you ever have trade, so let's say this new city that pops up that the Abbasids create, Baghdad, and so that's when their capital is going to be, and of course merchants are going to go there because that's the capital. And wherever there's merchants, we're going to see artisans who need to go there to get some of these new trade goods to make something new. And so if I'm a person who wants the best, newest trade goods, and I want to go to artisans, I'm going to go to the city, the center of trade. The more people that move in, because that's where all the luxury goods are, the more artisans and merchants that are going to visit, the more people that are going to visit. And so in the Islamic world, we're going to see some cities that are in excess of 1 million people. Let's contrast that with Europe at this time. The largest city in Europe is Paris, and that's maybe 10,000 people, as opposed to 1 million people in Baghdad, or of course, Spain at this point is still Muslim, so we have the city of Cordoba, which is also going to be a big, vibrant, growing, populated area. On the left-hand side, this is a very famous palace that you can find in Cordoba, Spain today, and you know that this was built during the time of Muslim occupation because we have these wonderful, beautiful geometric patterns on some of these arches. And we had talked about why you see geometric patterns in our last lecture in Islamic areas. Next, ideas spread. And so as we are trading with people from India and people from Greece and people from Europe and people from North Africa and people from Persia, Muslims are going to be exposed to all kinds of new ideas. And so that's going to just further enrich the Islamic world. So let's give you some examples. From Greece, as Muslims trade with the Greeks, they're going to learn about geometry. So way back in the classical age, Pythagoras and other Greeks had invented the basic concept of geometry. Muslims are going to look at this and like, oh, this is going to be super useful when we have to build a palace, if we're going to build something, or a new home, or if we're going to build a dock or a port. And so Muslims embrace this new knowledge they're learning about as they trade, from the Greeks and the Byzantines too. Next, as they trade east into Persia, what is today Iran, they're going to learn about another kind of math called algebra, finding the unknown quantity of something. And they're like, oh, this is good too. This is going to be very useful to us. And so we see here two examples of ideas going back and forth across the Islamic world, whether it be geometry or algebra. In fact, the term algebra comes from the Arabic word al-jabra, which then the Europeans will kind of smash together to make algebra. And so we have the spread of knowledge. Next, we've already talked about paper making from China. Now, the Abbasid Empire is we're gonna have a caliph, an emperor who's gonna like, all of this knowledge is awesome. We should have a place where we collect it all, where scholars and intellectuals can come and learn about all the new ideas spreading around this part of the world. And so they create this thing called the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. So it's this great place to go where people who were literate can come and learn about all the new ideas that are spreading back and forth across the Islamic world. Now, Muslims are going to be embracing new ideas at this time because in the Quran it says that new ideas are good. We need to be able to have math. So we not only just can create a big civilization, but we can keep track of the calendar and know when the holy month of Ramadan is. And so we see Muslims embracing the new at this point. They're embracing new ideas, new technology, and that's going to make for a very vibrant, strong Islamic culture at this time. So now let's talk about the decline of the Abbasid Empire. So far we've talked about how the Abbasid Empire, while not a conquering empire, is really known for its trade and its spread of ideas and goods and technology. And so what is going to make this long-lasting dynasty decline? Well, first of all, we're going to see emirs. We had talked about emirs being the local governors, right? In the far-flung Abbasid Empire, these local governors are going to lead the provinces for the Abbasids. Well, in the beginning, this was a good system because the emirs are from the local population, so the local population is willing to follow them. But also, the emirs are loyal to the Abbasids because the emirs got their jobs from the Abbasids, and you want to keep your employer happy, so you want to keep your job and do what they say. But as time goes on, the Abbasid Empire doesn't really pay attention to the emirs as much as they're supposed to, and so the emir becomes not an appointed job, but an inherited job. And so you get it not because you're good and you're loyal to the Abbasids, you get it because your dad was the emir, the governor, and then his dad before him. And so over time, we get these local governors, these emirs, who have the time to build up a power base from generation to generation to generation. They're able to get more and more and more powerful and become less and less and less loyal to the central Abbasid Empire. And they're going to use some of that power to eventually break away. Next, some emirs, especially here in Persia, and that is next to the capital of Baghdad, what they're going to do is they're going to like, okay, we want to break away, we want to control ourselves and not have to do what the Abbasids say anymore. So the local emir is going to claim that they are descended from Muhammad through Ali and his daughter. And so what they'll say is that we're descended from the Prophet, so we're the real legitimate rulers, not the Abbasids, who the Abbasids, by the way, are not related to the Prophet Muhammad. So if you can remember, in our last lecture, we talked about how there's a group of Muslims that believe that really the only person who can be Khalif, the leader of Islam, the Islamic world, should be related to the Prophet, and they were called Shia. And there are a lot of Shia here in Persia, and so we see that some emirs are going to play on this split in the Islamic world to create more power for themselves. So we see some religious differences besides just political differences. And so we see here that the Abbasid Empire is starting to fragment. It's starting to divide up into a bunch of different Islamic states that are not controlled by the Abbasids anymore. So we're getting rival, separate Islamic states competing with each other. Eventually, the Abbasids will fall when a new group of Muslims moves into the region. So here in Western Central Asia, there is an ethnic group of people that are pastoral nomads. They're always moving around looking for watering holes for their camels and goats and horses and sheep and those kinds of things. And they are called Turks. So Turks is an ethnic group. Now these Turks have converted to Islam because if they want to trade with the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasid Empire is much more likely to trade with them if they're the same religion. And so the Turks had previously converted to Islam, but as we see the Abbasid Empire start to weaken, they're going to come in and take advantage of that weakness and establish a new Islamic empire known as the Seljuk Empire. The Seljuks are a specific subgroup of Turks. So that's it for today. When we come back, we'll continue talking about part 3, the two Turkish empires, the Seljuk Empire and the Ottoman Empire.